So in 2006, I started Collective Intelligence, and in those early days of my consulting practice, I conducted a lot of training. Essentially, my business was a training-based organization, and many of the clients that I worked with, what they asked for was training, and what I gave them was training. And I'd often follow up with clients afterwards, and typically 9, 12 months after I'd done some training for them, and the conversations often had a similar theme. They'd often say, you know, Michael, your training was fantastic. We really got a lot out of the training. Everybody spoke really highly of it. We all learned something. And when I said, okay, so how's the performance? You know, what are you getting the actual results that you were expecting? And often I would get the same response. They would say something along the lines of, well, we did see a bit of an improvement, but actually things kind of actually plateaued or went back to the way they've always been. And so that bothered me, because I actually take a lot of pride in the work that I do, and I wanted clients to get the results. So it really took me on a whole journey of sort of exploring how do you get sustainable behavioral change in people, and I spent a lot of time investigating that, and I realized that my whole model was flawed, and I was actually giving, although people were asking for training, what they needed was something else, and so today I want to share with you some reflections and insights that I've learned, and hopefully that will help you in your business in terms of how do you unlock high performance in your people. And I'm not here to suggest that there isn't a role for training, because I do think there is. However, my observations is that if you want to create behavioral change, you really need to focus on changing habits. Does that make sense to some of you? Okay, so many of you have probably, you yourself have been to some kind of training. You've spent a day or 2 days at some kind of training program, and no doubt the content was good. Hopefully the trainer was good. But over that time, after you left, you probably had good intentions to put that training into action. However, you no doubt slipped back into a familiar pattern of behavior, and perhaps didn't get the full value out of that training. And so our whole approach to helping organizations and helping people is to help them build high-performance habits. And we found that a coaching-based methodology works really well for that. Let's move on. So I've always admired people who achieve extraordinary things, and this is an image of Mount Everest. Anyone here a climber? Okay, good. I don't feel bad. I'm not a climber either. I've just always admired people who do extraordinary things, and climbing high mountains such as Everest is no small task, and it requires a huge amount of effort and preparation, and climatization is a really key piece of the actual process of Everest. And I actually did a little bit of research into it, and it actually takes about 2 months for anyone to actually complete the ascent to the summit of Mount Everest, and that's from the base camp. So it takes 2 months for them to do that, but obviously there's years of preparation to get them just to base camp. And so often we see people do extraordinary things, and we think, wow, they looked extraordinary. They looked like they must be incredibly talented. And my, thoughts on that is that there's often a lot of things that they've been doing to reach that point. So today I want to share some insights into high-performance habits and why change is particularly difficult. This is Alex Honnold. He's a 34-year-old American climber. He's best known for his free solo ascent of big walls, and just a little over a year ago, he completed something that no one had ever done before. He free soloed El Cap, they call it, or El Capitan, which is in Yosemite National Park, and he holds the fastest ascent record for Yosemite's Triple Crown, which is an 18-hour and 50-minute link-up of 3 mountains. And so today I wanted to inspire you and start this session by sharing a short little clip from his movie that just was recently released and won a number of awards. So wasn't that extraordinary? How many of you have sweaty palms right now? I mean, every time I watch that, I've watched it a few times, and every time I still have sweaty palms. It's just... I actually went and saw this. Did anyone else in the room see it? There we've got 2 people. 3 people, sorry. 4. Okay, do we have 5? It was extraordinary. I mean, it's extraordinary seeing this, but on the big screen, it was insane. I kept catching myself holding my breath for seconds at a time. So, you know, Alex started climbing in a gym when he was the age of 5, and by the age of 10, he was climbing several times a week. And he participated in many national and international youth climbing competitions and championships as a teenager. Yet he says, and he said in this quote here, that he was not naturally gifted. And so I'm fascinated by how somebody who's ordinary does something so extraordinary. And so from my perspective, his free solo record of El Capitan was the aggregation of numerous high-performance habits. For 2 years, he prepared just for this one achievement. And in those 2 years, he was practicing and was repeating the route and the exact same ascent over and over, so it eventually became habitualized. And that, I think, is one of the key takeaways from this film that I wanted to share with you. Okay, so today I wanted to move on and talk about why tiny changes make a difference and why change is actually really quite difficult, and give you some insights that I've learned as I've went along. So this diagram here explains the path towards habitualizing something. So all habits follow a similar trajectory from effortful practice to automatic behavior, and this process is known as automaticity. Is that how you say it? I must struggle with that word. And it's the ability to perform a behavior without thinking, okay? And without, you know, each step actually becomes an unconscious behavior. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's 4 stages of competence. This is also known as the 4 stages of learning. And probably the best way to think about this is if you think back to when you actually were learning, before you learned to drive a car. So how many of you can remember that period just before you started learning to drive? Can you remember that? I certainly remember when I was, 14 or 15, and I was a cocky young teenager, and I'd watch my mom and dad drive, and I'd think, how hard can this be? Like, my mom can drive, I can drive, right? And I remember thinking about that, and at that point, I was unconsciously incompetent. In other words, I wasn't aware of the things that I wasn't aware of, right? Because I hadn't started driving yet. And then I remember that first time I got behind the wheel and I started driving, and I realized, oh my God, there's a little more to this than I had thought. And that's when I moved to the second stage, which is I'm consciously incompetent. I'm aware of the things that I don't know or that are difficult. Yeah? And then eventually, with some training, some lessons, I became consciously competent. In other words, I actually had to be very focused. And you may remember this, like you're driving, and as long as no one was talking to you, you had to have the radio off, and you really were focusing on what you were doing, you could drive. And then you get to the point that most of you in this room have achieved, where tonight you'll get in the car, you drive home, and you may even have a conversation on the phone or with someone in the car, and you're not even paying attention to what you're doing. It's just become automated. And what's actually happened is your brain has actually created shortcuts, habits, to be able to allow it to free up your cognitive function to focus on other tasks. And in fact, most of our life, in fact, 40% of our day, they estimate, is actually a series of habits, habitualized patterns. And so the brain is incredibly effective at finding ways to be able to do things that free the brain up to be able to focus on anything that requires cognitive function, cognitive focus. Does that make sense? So this has kind of fascinated me, and I guess to me the ultimate purpose of habits is to solve problems of life with as little energy as possible. So I wanted to start with this quote here: how we actually spend our days is how we spend our lives. And that at first might seem really obvious, right? But what I wanted to say is that if we actually want to achieve something as grand as Alex did, it's actually about how the little moments, it's all the little things that are added up that eventuate in high performance. And so most people want instant gratification. They want quick results. And I'm often telling clients, I wish there was a silver bullet, but there isn't. The reason most of my engagements with clients are 6 or 12 months long is it takes about that long for people to habitualize the patterns. A lot of the work that I do is working with non-salespeople to help them to win work without becoming a salesperson. And many of them don't have the routines and the habits yet that people that are effective at winning work have. So it takes time to develop those habits. And so it's these small choices, little habits that transform us every day already. Does anybody know the story of the back there? Was chatting with John. So I lived in the UK from 2000 to 2002. I moved to Australia in 2002, and a year later, in 2003, the fate of British cycling changed, and professional cycling in Great Britain hired this guy here in the car. His name is Dave Brailsford. He's now Sir Dave Brailsford, and he was hired as their performance director. And in 110 years, no British cyclist had ever won the Tour de France. And so Brailsford was hired to set their cycling team on a whole new trajectory. But what made him different from previous coaches was he had this commitment to a strategy, and his strategy was the aggregation of marginal gains. And that was his philosophy and approach to developing this team. And he and his coaches began making really small adjustments, things like bike seats. They actually changed some of the equipment that the cyclists were using. They gave them electrically heated overshorts to keep their muscles at an ideal temperature. They had biofeedback sensors. They actually switched racing suits. The indoor suits were actually more aerodynamic than the ones that they were using outdoor, so they started using those outdoor. But they didn't stop there. They kept focusing on trying to find that 1% improvement in overlooked or unexpected areas. And things that they did were they started testing things like massage gels and finding out which ones improved their recovery better. They looked at they actually engaged a surgeon to teach them how to wash their hands properly so that they wouldn't catch a cold, because they knew that that impacted their recovery and their performance and their ability to train. And so they actually tested all kinds of things. They even found certain pillows gave them better night's sleep, and that would give them an edge. And so it was this aggregation of tiny, tiny little improvements that actually made a massive difference. And so just 5 years after Brailsford took over, the British cycling team dominated the road and also the medals in major events around the world. And during a 10-year span from 2007 to 2017, the British cyclists won 178 world championships. And they actually won 66 Olympic medals. And does anybody want to guess how many Tour de France's they won? It was 5. 5 Tour de France's in 10 years. And in the previous 110 years, they'd never won one. So it was, I think, quite an extraordinary achievement and another example of how, you know, the aggregation of just small little changes can really add up. And so one of the things that I do when I'm working with clients, and particularly around the changing habits, is getting them to do something every day, okay? If we actually change something, do something every day, even a small amount. So if it's exercise, like even 5 minutes of exercise is better than no exercise, okay? How many of you have gym memberships? Just a show of hands, okay? Well, I'm not going to embarrass you, but if you're like me, I've had periods in my life where there's been long gaps between going to the gym, and I can see a few of you can relate. And I read a book called Atomic Habits, and one of the things that it inspired me to do was to do some experiments on myself. And so one of the things that I noticed is I would have periods where I would be really busy with work, probably much like yourself, where I'd look at my watch and I'd say, I just don't have time to get to the gym for an hour or an hour and a half workout, so I'll not go. So I would not go for days, and then that days would turn into weeks. And you know, that might sound familiar for some of you. And so one of the things that I changed was I changed the way I thought about this, and I started looking at it and going, well, I do have time to go to the gym for 15 minutes. And at first I went, well, what's the point? You know, like 15 minutes isn't really going to make a difference. But you know, if I apply what I've learned from Dale Brailsford, the aggregation of those little 15 minutes over years really adds up. And so I started doing that. I started going, okay, well, I'm going to go every day or as many times a week. And if it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, that's fine. At least I made it, because that's better than nothing. And what I noticed was 2 things. One is that when I got there, often I actually would stay longer than 15 minutes. And 2 was it actually started to keep me in the habit of going. And so if there's another key takeaway out of today is often we go, like a lot of the clients that I coach them around business development, and they say, well, you know, I'm just so busy right now, I don't have time to go out and have coffee and meet with potential clients. And I said, okay, could you do 15 minutes a day? You wouldn't be able to go out and have a coffee, you might not be able to go out and have a lunch with someone, but you could actually pick up the phone or send them an email. You could actually schedule a coffee or a lunch in 2, 3, 4 weeks from now. And they go, oh yeah, I could do that. And so it's those little incremental daily activities that add up over time. Okay, so the other thing that I learned from the book Atomic Habits is having a clear plan to implement a habit is going to increase dramatically your chances of success. So one of my favorite strategies for developing habits is called implementation intention. And many people think that they just suffer from a lack of motivation, when in fact, in reality, it's just the clarity in how they're going to implement a new habit. And so in 2001, some researchers in the UK did a really interesting experiment around exercise. They took a group of people and they divided them up into 3 different groups. The first group was the control group, and the control group were just simply asked to track how often they exercised. Okay. The second group, they actually that was the motivation group. So in addition to tracking how often they exercised, they actually gave them some motivational videos to watch around the benefits of exercise. And the third group, they added something else to that. And what they did was during that 2-week period, all they were asked was to specify when and for how long they were going to actually work out. So they actually said, I will partake in 20 minutes of vigorous activity or exercise every Monday at 6 a.m., for example. That's all that they had to do extra. And what was really fascinating was the results. The first two groups had a 35 to 38% of them actually exercised every week. But the third group, 91% of that group exercised every week. And so the point here is that actually by having an implementation intention, by actually specifying when and for how long, it actually will dramatically increase your chances of results. Does that make sense? So, for example, if you want to meditate, you might say, okay, I'm going to meditate for 1 minute at 7 a.m. in my kitchen or in my living room or in my bedroom. That's the kind of, that's what an implementation intention might sound like. So here's another interesting strategy to help you develop a robust plan to adjust for challenges that are no doubt going to come up and might prevent you from achieving some of the goals that you want to set. So imagine it's 6 months from now and you've actually failed at achieving the goal that you want. You've not achieved it, you've actually failed. And what I want you to do is actually conduct what's called a pre-mortem rather than a post-mortem. So the idea is unpack what are some of the potential reasons that would have led to you failing. Okay, so so there's all kinds of things that you could imagine that would come up that would take you off course. And once you have those laid out all on the table, then you can actually start to make some better choices. And we can start to think about, okay, well, there's going to be days where I'm perhaps up in Sydney, and so I'm not going to be able to get to the gym. So what could I do instead? So on those days, what can I do instead? So this morning I got up, and at 6:30, I did some push-ups in my hotel room, I did some sit-ups in my hotel room, and in the past I would have thought, well, is it really worth it? It won't really make that much of a difference. But those are the things that help you to be able to achieve and stay with your habits. So maintaining your habits is important, and anticipating things that are going to take you off course. So if you're going to go, for example, on a 2-week holiday or a 4-week holiday, thinking about, okay, well, I'm not going to be in my normal routine. I'm not going to be able to go to my gym, but what can I do instead? And having a plan is going to make a big difference. All right, so the other thing that's often overlooked is your environment. And perhaps the most overlooked driver of habits and human behavior is our physical environment, okay? So making it to the summit requires the right conditions, doesn't it? Alex had to wait for the right environment. If he went and tried to do the climb that he did in pouring rain, it would have had a huge impact on his result. And similarly, your environment can make it easier or harder for good habits. And it's conditions of your business. If the conditions of your business aren't conducive, it will make it next to impossible to build high-performance habits. So there was an interesting study done at a hospital in the United States in Boston where a doctor had this really crazy idea. And she believed that she could improve the eating habits of thousands of hospital staff and patients without actually having to speak a word to them. All they had to do was actually change their environment. And what they did was they designed a 6-month study where they actually altered the choice architecture of the hospital cafeteria. And I thought it was really, really fascinating. All they did was they started by changing how the drinks were arranged in the room. So originally, the refrigerator was located next to the cashier, and it was filled with lots of soda. So it had Coca-Cola, and all the drinks that are bad for us. And the researchers, all they did was they started adding water into those, and they rearranged it so that water was at the front and those other drinks were at the back. And what they found was they were able to dramatically change the buying patterns or the consumption patterns of people in the hospital. And I think that this is just an example of how environments can change or influence us. So this is actually a photograph I took at one of my clients. This is a law firm in Melbourne, and this is their kitchen, part of their kitchen at least. And it was something that I noticed when I went to make a cup of tea one day, that every time I've been back, every day in the morning, one of the staff put out a bunch of healthy treats. And but there's also some unhealthy treats that are tucked back here. So those are some worms, you know, those sugary worms. So what they've done is they've created an environment where the healthy choices are predominant and are easily accessed, and the unhealthy ones are less accessible. So one of the things that happens is that, you know, if you have beer in your fridge, and you open up your fridge and you stare at the beer, the chances of you drinking a beer are much higher than if it's tucked down in the crisper way at the back under some vegetables. So, you know, these are the kind of things that can impact our behavior. And so in the workplace, those things can happen. So, for example, I was chatting with a client yesterday about this, and he said, all right, Michael, but so, you know, how can I change my environment in my office, like, you know, what in terms of helping me to build a business development habit? And so we talked about it. And, you know, one of the things was just removing distractions. So how many of you have emails that pop up on your computer, and you find yourself looking at those emails that they pop in? How many of you do that? You know, most of us do. All right, so, and there's a lot of science that has come out in the last few years around distraction, and how just that, just seeing it pop up on our screen will actually interrupt our thought patterns, and it makes it really difficult for us to get back to where we were previously. And so I said, you know, we went through some examples of ways that he could actually change his physical environment to reduce distractions. Putting in actual reminders into his calendar that had an alarm to do a certain activity, asking his assistant to come in and remind him and check up with him at the end of the day. Things like that can really make a big difference. The author of Atomic Habits, he shared in a talk that he actually removed, had his EA log him out of all his social media on Monday, and then give him the passwords on Friday, so he had no way to access social media. All right, so let's look at some other things that are really kind of interesting. If you want to master habits, one of the keys is to start with repetition, not perfection. A lot of us are focused on being great at things right away, and I encourage people to just get started. And the more repetitions, the more you're starting to get evidence that you're actually moving towards what you want. And so there's another interesting experiment done by a professor in Florida, where he was teaching photography, and he divided his class into two. So he said, all the people on the right, I want you to focus on taking as many photos as you possibly can over the time period. And you're going to get graded on the quality of photos based on the volume. And then the other half of the room, he said, I want you to just focus on taking the perfect photo. And so there was a focus on not on volume, but on quality. And at the end of the year, he found it really fascinating, because the quantity group delivered much better quality photos. Now, how many of you have a digital camera or a phone? You know, almost everybody in this room. How many of you remember having a film-based camera? Okay. Now, I remember, you know, I think, okay, I've got 24 shots. I have to really think about, which shots I'm going to take. And I remember, like being very, I'd really like to take a picture of John with the kids now, but we still, we've got another 3 hours at Disneyland. I'd spread it out. But nowadays, we like click, 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 click. We just take so many. And what happens is we often get some amazing photos. There's 100 crappy photos and one really, decent, amazing photo. And I think that's the same thing that applies. Is that so the more we do something, the more likely we are to get a better result. The other thing that can really help with behaviors is getting a reward. So many of the things that we want to achieve and we want to develop a habit to do, we actually don't get rewarded till sometime in the future. Okay. So for example, if you go to the gym today, it's not going to have a massive impact. You're not going to see the reward immediately, are you? Maybe if you're Arnold Schwarzenegger. But like the idea is that it often is going to take 6, 9, 12 months before we're going to see the impact of those results. And so the idea is that how do we bring forward the reward? And so one of the concepts that I've come across is to actually reward ourselves now. And so one of the best ways to do that is actually to track our progress. So actually keeping a journal, logging what we've done, having a calendar, a paper-based calendar, and actually putting an X on the wall every day that we do something, actually is giving us a tiny little reward that actually gives us some motivation to keep going. Okay, so this is a quote from Seth Godin, and what's really interesting is that with consistency and repetition, you can actually change not only your results, but actually your identity. And one of the things that I found really fascinating when I look into habits is that many of the people that I coach and work with don't associate themselves with being that person. So for example, if I'm working with clients around business development, many of them don't see themselves in that role. They don't see themselves as a rainmaker, for example, but that's really what we want to identify. So the goal is not to win $500,000 in revenue. The goal is actually to be a rainmaker. Because the way to being someone is through doing. So every time you practice painting, you are being an artist. Every time you practice writing, you're being a writer. Every time that you play a sport, you're being an athlete. So whatever it is that you want to achieve, just think about what is it that you're being. And it's a really interesting idea to start to think beyond just the immediate goal. It's what are you becoming, and how is your identity changing? And what's interesting is every time we do something, like every time we go to the gym, we're actually providing ourselves with evidence that we are becoming what we set out, that intention. So habits are not only a method through which we achieve external measures of success, like losing weight or reducing stress, but they're also the path through which we achieve internal change and actually how we can become someone new. So, how many of you are lousy at remembering names? Okay. For years, I was horrible at remembering names. I was something that I was always admired. I would meet someone and they would, remember my name and other people's names. Have you ever met someone who's really good at remembering names? Is it something that impressed you? So about roughly 10 years ago, I decided I wanted to become one of those people that remember names. And so I actually have developed a habit of remembering names. And it's actually become a sport for me. So, if I go to a barbecue or an event where there's lots of people like this, and I don't know them, and they don't have name tags, I see that as a huge sport and an opportunity. So I wanted to offer you the opportunity to learn how to remember names. Who would like to learn how to remember names? Okay. So I'm going to share with you 3 things that you can do that are going to dramatically increase your chances of remembering names. Okay. So the first thing that the first mistake people make is they're not actually present when they meet someone. So how many of you have met someone, they've said their name, and within a second you've already forgotten their name, right? Happens to most of us. So one of the reasons that we do that is that we're not actually focused and in that moment when we're talking to the person, all right? So, so if we meet someone for the first time, the first thing that I do is I'm really focused on being present with the person. I'm focused on what they're about to say. So when I met Alex this morning, I was focusing on her name and immediately that's the first thing, being just registering. Now that seems really obvious, but a lot of us are thinking about what we're going to say next, or did I put enough money in the meter, or things like that, right? So we're not actually in the moment when we're not actually paying attention. Okay. So the second thing is to repeat their name 3 times in 15 seconds. Okay. Now, so who do we have over here? So I've got Jeff. All right. So if I was to meet Jeff for the first time, I might say, "Oh, good morning. My name's Michael," and you say,
"Morning, Jeff."
Hi, Jeff. Nice to meet you. I've repeated his name once. Is that Jeff with a J?
With a G.
It's Jeff with a G. Okay. I've just repeated his name 3 times, but I haven't done it in a way that's kind of awkward, like Jeff, Jeff, Jeff. Weird, right? Like that'd be really weird. But what I've done is I've repeated his name 3 times in 15 seconds without him even noticing. Why would I do that? What's the benefit?
Repetition.
Repetition helps us with short-term memory. Okay, so the repetition of it helps us to register it into our name. Okay. The third thing I want you to do then is to link it to someone memorable, okay? Okay, so I grew up with a friend, one of my neighbors, his name was Jeff. He kind of reminds me of Jeff, he looks a bit like Jeff. So if I just go, oh, I have a neighbor named Jeff, it looks a little bit like you, it'd be easy to remember. I'll even verbalize that because what happens is it creates another neural pathway for me to remember his name, okay? So before you do that, here's a little tip. So if the person's name's Robert, what could you say? Do you prefer Bob or Rob, Robert, or Bob? You know, how many of you have met a Sandra? Do you prefer Sandra or Sandy? You know, do you prefer Stephen or Steve? Is that Stephen with a P? Those are some of the little ways that you can repeat their name 3 times in 15 seconds. So just take. So my challenge to you is to challenge yourself to make this a sport for you. And what I found is that it doesn't happen unconsciously. I have to actually consciously do it. And over time, by repeating it, practicing it, making it a sport, it's eventually become habitualized for me. So now I do that when I meet people for the first time. I'll follow those 3 steps. I'll focus on being present in the moment with the person. I'll repeat their name 3 times in 15 seconds, and then I'll try to link it to something or someone memorable. Okay, and that helps to force it into my short-term memory. Now, you know, I don't remember people's names every time, all the time, but it's dramatically improved the amount of times I remember names. And people really are always impressed because our name is something that's really personal, and people, it really, people notice it when you remember the names. Okay. All right, I've got a few minutes left. Yeah, Bill.
Sorry, what about surnames? We can sort of,
yeah.
forget, you know, it's easier, but surnames like things that sort of kind of do.
You would have to ask that question. It's a good question. So one of the things that I've also found, because often people say, okay, what about people who have really unusual names, like a name that I've never heard? It's an uncommon name, or a name that's not an everyday name in, say, in a Western culture. What I've found is actually asking the person to spell out their name. And what I've found is that when I say, you know, I might meet you, and I say, you say your name's something unusual, I might say, that's a really unusual name. It's the first time I've ever met someone with that name. Would you mind just spelling that for me? I really want to make sure that I pronounce it correctly. And actually, when they spell it and I practice pronouncing it, it goes into my short-term memory, but also it actually is a huge form of respect for the other person, because 99% of people who meet that person usually go, oh, too hard basket, and guess what they call them? Mate, buddy, something like that, right? So they don't actually use the person's name. So I would use the same technique, but I think you can use the same technique, like my surname is Schiffner, kind of like Claudia Schiffer, but with an N. You know? Now, you're going to remember that a lot easier than if I was to just say my name's Schiffner. I have a friend whose name's Sorab, and what he does is he says, you know, like sore abs? Sorab? And people go, oh, and they remember it because Sorab is something that was unusual for them to remember. So, all right, well, have fun practicing, and I hope to hear from you in terms of some of your wins in terms of remembering names. In a moment, I'd like to open for a few questions. We've got a little bit of time left before we wrap up, but before I do, I just wanted to say a special thank you to the HLB MenJud team for not only the invitation to speak, but all the work that went into hosting this event and this whole series. So I just want to acknowledge all those people for the amount of work that goes into these events. And I also wanted to thank you for being a terrific audience. And I hope that you've gained some insights into habits and why tiny habits can make a difference. And for those of you that are interested, I'd love to share with you some of the key takeaways from today. So for me, I want to invite you to start to think about repetition and why repetition is so important. Two is that we want to try to optimize for the start line and to actually to try to find ways to reward yourself to getting started. Habits are I thought all the accountants in the room, being HLB MenJud, you guys would enjoy this. Habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. In other words, you know, every time with the accumulation of those habits, it really adds up over time. And focusing on our systems instead of goals. And I really want you to test some assumptions and beliefs that you might have. So, for anyone